Well, thank you, and good morning once again. Mr. Smith mentioned in terms at the beginning of his sermonette about giving the first sermonette back after the feast. I have always felt like over the years that the first sermon after the feast was probably the most difficult sermon of the year. People have come back and they've been there for 8 days. They've been hearing all of these sermons and all of these things, and it's like you come back and what do you say? What is there left to say? Well, it has been an exciting feast, and I can tell just from the comments that I've seen and heard that there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of positive enthusiasm. We come back, we're encouraged, we're rejuvenated, and these are all positive things. And, of course, what happens is we get back, it's hard to realize, a week ago we were scattered all over creation. From Scotland to Canada to various feast sites all over the U.S. Just 1 week ago, we were there for the last great day. And now here, a week has passed. And you know what happens? You come home, and I suspect most of us got home on Sunday evening. Some got back a little later in the week, but a number get back on Sunday evening, and what are you confronted with? Well, immediately you've got to go to work. You've got to you come in, and if you're like me, I couldn't have stayed one more day, at least not unless I'd found a laundromat, or my wife had found a laundromat. Actually, would have been more realistically what would have happened, because I brought home a suitcase full of dirty clothes. And you come home and you've got all of these things, and you go to the post office and you collect all the mail that is accumulated and all of the various things. And so now you're back to reality. You come back and you've made a long trip, you get in, and you've got catch up to do. You've got to you've got to get back to work. You've got to try to get things back to normalcy around home, get things unpacked, get settled in, get back to everyday life. And a lot of effort and energy gets put into that, particularly in the first week when you're trying to get back in regular routine. And that becomes, it's very easy after a while for all of the excitement of the feast to sort of settle back down into regular, normal, day in and day out routine. It's interesting when we look through the Scriptures, particularly the book of 2 Chronicles, and we find something interesting here in this particular book, and that is the fact of the number of special festival celebrations that are recorded in the book of 2 Chronicles. And particularly when you put together with that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra is responsible for having compiled the books of Chronicles, which tell the story of God's people and God's working with His people from a different perspective than Samuel and Kings. If you go through the story, and we've been, of course, going through some of this in Bible study more recently, that the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings are consecutive. You pick up the story in the beginning of 1 Samuel with the latter period of the Judges, and you come all the way through when you get to the end of 2 Kings. You've read a consecutive story that culminates with Judah finally going into captivity. We come through, Samuel, the last of the Judges, and then Saul and David and Solomon and the division of the kingdom, and down through Israel going into captivity, and then finally Judah going into captivity. And we come to the end of that story there in 2 Kings, and it's just one consecutive story. When you take 1st and 2nd Chronicles, those books retell the story, but from a different perspective. Much of what is dwelt on in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings is skipped over in the books of Chronicles. 1st Chronicles starts out with a genealogy beginning with Adam, but very little is said about Samuel. His name is mentioned in the genealogies. Very little is said about Samuel by comparison. Very, very little is said about King Saul, just a very brief mention. You find that the northern kingdom of Israel, after the split that occurred when after Solomon's death, that very little is said about the northern kingdom of Israel. It is only peripherally mentioned. The books of Chronicles, First Chronicles, after setting the stage in the first about 9 chapters of sort of working through with a lot of genealogy, picks up the story and spends most of First Chronicles about the life and the reign, particularly of King David. Second Chronicles begins with Solomon becoming king and follows all the way through to the time of the captivity of Judah, and then ends up with Cyrus's decree that allowed the people to return in the days of Zerubbabel. The book of Second Chronicles then covers a period of a little over 400 years, just a little short of 450 years in terms of a time span. But Second Chronicles focuses on things, even though it omits, because it's not intended to just simply retell the story of Samuel and Kings. You already have Samuel and Kings, so you don't need exactly just the same words repeated. But with any event, with any story, it depends on your perspective. If you were to tell everything that occurred, well, if you were to tell everything that occurred just in one day of your life, and you were to write it out minute by minute, you would have obviously this, voluminous amount of material. You couldn't, within a matter of a few weeks, you'd have more accumulated than anybody could read, a lot of which nobody would be interested in, right? So anytime you tell a story, you go through and you select out the things that are significant. Now, what appears significant can vary over a period of time. We look at things maybe that have occurred in our lifetime. We can look at the story of the church. We can look at things that have happened in our nation and realize that depending on maybe what you're going through at the moment or what is happening now, certain things in the past become more significant. We look back, in retrospect, and we realize that there are things that were very important that maybe at the moment we didn't attach a lot of significance to. Second Chronicles, in focusing on the story of the monarchy from the time of King David's death until the captivity of Judah and then the decree of Cyrus that allowed Jews to return from Babylon, focuses in on several periods of revival and rededication among the people of ancient Israel. And these are all connected with the festivals of God, with certain significant festivals that are highlighted. The people celebrated the festival seasons. They came to appear before God 3 times in the year, 3 seasons in the year, year in, year out. And you count that up over a period of 450 years, and you're looking at many, many hundreds of festivals. Hundreds of times that people trekked to Jerusalem for the Passover or for Pentecost or for the Feast of Tabernacles. And yet of all of those hundreds of times that people made that trek, there are only a few that are picked out that are highlighted, and events, in some cases a chapter or 2 or 3, is devoted talking about that particular festival and the things that surrounded it. Ezra, who wrote the book of Chronicles, and as well as the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, continued on in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, focusing also on several festivals, actually 3 different festival seasons, 3 different festival occasions that are mentioned in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's sort of interesting because in the book of Second Chronicles there are 4 festivals that are focused on, and in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah there are 3. So there are really 7 festival periods that are focused on in this period, or these books that were written here after the exile, because and they focus in on things that occurred, and there's some valuable lessons for us. I would like for us to look at these festivals that were centers and focal points for revival and rededication among the people of God. But then as we look at that and we understand what happened and the excitement and the high, and you read some of these stories and you realize that it was like a wonderful Feast of Tabernacles, and people were all excited and they were all pumped up and they went back home. And you see, ultimately, when we talk about the success of the festival, the success of the feast, you know, the success of the feast really is yet to be determined. Because the real success is, to what extent has it made a difference in our lives? You can go and you can enjoy the fun and the fellowship and the sermons and all of the various things that are a part of it. But if we come back and once the dust settles and we get unpacked, nothing is any different than before we went, then you have to say not a whole lot was accomplished. The first festival that is focused on here in the book of 2 Chronicles is right here in the early part that centers around the dedication of the temple. The 2 Chronicles chapter 1 starts with Solomon taking the kingdom at the death of his father, King David. And we're told in 2 Chronicles chapter 1 that Solomon, the son of David, was strengthened in his kingdom. The eternal his God was with him and magnified him exceedingly. And Solomon spoke to all Israel, to all the leaders, and all of the congregation. The people went, verse 3, to the high place at Gibeon. That's where the tabernacle was. Now, this is the tabernacle that Moses had made in the wilderness, and it was pitched at Gibeon. The ark of God had been brought up. You remember the story way back in the beginning of when Samuel was still a teenager. The ark had been captured by the Philistines. The ark had resided in the tabernacle from the time of Moses, the time it had been built, on up until the Philistines had captured it. And the ark evidently never returned to the tabernacle. The tabernacle was there in Shiloh, and the tabernacle, of course, by its very nature, could be picked up and moved. When the ark was removed, when the Philistines captured it, and then they sent it back, you read of various locations. David had moved it. It had been for a number of years at Kirjath-Jearim, and David had moved it and pitched a tent for it at Jerusalem, but this wasn't the tabernacle of Moses. So Solomon and the people went to Gibeon, where the tabernacle of Moses was. The ark was here in Jerusalem in a location that David had brought it up, Kirjath-Jearim, there during his reign. And we read here as the sacrifices that were offered before God, and God communed with King Solomon there in Gibeon. And so Solomon returned, we're told from verse 13, from his journey to the high place at Gibeon to Jerusalem. He came from the tabernacle of the congregation, came back there to his capital. And in chapter 2, he determined to build a house for the name of the Eternal, and a house for his kingdom. And David, you remember, had made a lot of preparations for the building of the temple. And so you go through in chapter 2 and talks about some of the details. Chapter 3, verse 1, Solomon began to build the house of the Eternal in Jerusalem in Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared unto David his father in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Arnon the Jebusite. He began to build the second day of the second month in the 4th year of his reign. So this is just a matter of a little over 2 weeks after the Passover of the 4th year of his reign. If you remember the story of how the place was selected, this is told earlier in 1 Chronicles. How did they know where to build the temple? You remember a plague had come on the nation. A plague because really of a sin of David. A plague had come on the nation, and David besought God to please intervene. And he looked up and saw a vision. He saw the angel, the death angel that was coming through with his sword drawn. And he was stopped. God stopped him right there above the threshing floor of Ornan. And Jerusalem was spared and the plague stopped. And so that spot beneath which the angel stopped, David then went there, and that place was the place of his communion with God, and that was the place that was then selected. That was where God had set His name. That was the point at which He spared Judah and Jerusalem. Now it goes through, and Solomon begins to build the house of the Lord, and it describes the building of it, and describes the building of the altar in chapter 4, and all of the things, chapter 5, verse 1. All the work that Solomon made for the house of the Lord was finished. And he brought in all the things that David his father had dedicated, the silver and the gold, the instruments, and he put them among the treasures of the house of God. And he assembled the elders of Israel and the heads of the tribes and the chief of the fathers of the children of Israel to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. It was relocated. The ark was at this point residing right there near the capital, near the palace in the old citadel called the city of David. And now the Levites took up the ark, and they brought the ark, verse 5, and the tabernacle of the congregation, and all the holy vessels that were in the tabernacle, these did the priests and the Levites bring up. So the things that had been constructed for the tabernacle, it was now taken down in Gibeon and brought here to Jerusalem, and the articles of furniture that Moses had designed, or God had actually designed them. Moses was the one who conveyed the pattern. All of these things are now brought here to the temple. And we find that as they came here, they brought all of these things into the temple, and it describes that, and describes the Levites and the singers, and in verse 12 of chapter 5, and the orchestra, the trumpeters and the singers, and they made this great, beautiful music to be heard in praising and thanking God, described in verse 13. And we find at the conclusion of this, latter part of verse 13, then the house was filled with a cloud, even the house of the eternal, so that the priest could not stand to minister by reason of the cloud, for the glory of the eternal had filled the house of God. And then Solomon began to pray here, and this is recorded in chapter 6, and describes his prayer. And in chapter 7, verse 1, when Solomon had made an end of praying, fire came down from heaven, consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the eternal filled the house. So Solomon and the people had done what they could do, and now the glory of the eternal filled the house. And this, you can just imagine, this great whoosh of fire, of flame that comes down from heaven, and here this burnt offering laid out and everything, and the whole thing is consumed. The God of heaven has accepted what the people have built, what they have contributed to building this ark, this temple. And the ark now is there in the temple, and we're told in verse 2 of chapter 7, the priest couldn't enter into the house of the eternal because the glory of the eternal had filled the house. And when all the children of Israel saw how the fire came down and the glory of the Lord upon the house, they bowed themselves with their faces to the ground upon the pavement and worshiped. You better believe, you see something like that, and everybody's attention was gotten in a very dramatic way. And so it describes in verse 5, Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 oxen, 120,000 sheep. Now that's, considerable sacrifice. And the king and the people dedicated the house of God. And the priests waited on their offices, and the Levites also with the instruments of music of the Lord, which David the king had made to praise the Lord. And so, verse 7, Solomon hallowed the middle of the court before the house of the Lord, for there he offered burnt offerings. Because the brazen altar that Solomon made wasn't able to receive all the burnt offerings. So they actually had to, utilize greater portion of the temple court. Now notice, verse 8, also at the same time, Solomon kept the feast 7 days, and all Israel with him, a very great congregation from the entering in of Hamath unto the river of Egypt. And in the 8th day they made a solemn assembly, for they kept the dedication of the altar 7 days, and the feast 7 days. And on the 23rd day of the 7th month he sent the people away to their tents, glad and merry in heart, for the goodness that the Lord had showed unto David, to Solomon, and to Israel his people. tremendous event. This occurred at the feast time of the Feast of Tabernacles. They celebrated leading up to the feast. They had a double feast that year. Sometimes you say, well, boy, it'd be great to keep it for another 7 days. Well, they showed up and they observed a feast of dedicating the temple for 7 days. Solomon obviously footed the bill for a lot of that. That's where the 120,000 sheep and the 22,000 oxen were slaughtered, and what, of course, the fat and the entrails burned there on the altar. But much of this was consumed, you see, by the priests and the people. Great festive time, 7 days leading up to the Feast of Tabernacles, and then they observed the Feast of Tabernacles, and the 8th day is solemn assembly, the last great day. And if you track it through the calendar, the feast always begins on the 15th day of the 7th month, and the last great day is on the 22nd day of the 7th month. And so on the 23rd day, Solomon sent the people away, and they all went back home. Here was this tremendous event. It was a rededication of the whole nation to God. And the very presence of God was there. In a very dramatic way, God poured out His blessings. The people had seen a tremendous miracle. Solomon himself, of course, saw a tremendous miracle. He was right there. He was involved in it. He knew that he had no power to fill the house with glory. He had no power to bring down fire from heaven. But he saw these things. And he was there, and he saw it, and the people were there, and they all saw these things. A tremendous occurrence, as it describes the things that occurred and the years that went by. And all of these things that occurred, God appeared to Solomon after this dedication of the temple, after this wonderful feast. Then chapter 8 of 2 Chronicles picks up the story at the end of 20 years, after Solomon had built the house of the Lord and built his own house. And we began to look at the last 20 years of Solomon's reign, picking up just a short time after the temple had been completed, and all of these things. And you read of tremendous things, as you go on through. Solomon, as we're told on back here in 2 Chronicles chapter 9, talks about the Queen of Sheba coming up here to visit Solomon and to inquire of him and all the things that she saw. And as we come on down through the story, that in verse 21, that well, let's notice here in chapter 8, just the end of the chapter. Talks about in verse 17, Solomon went to Ezion-Geber and to Elat on the seaside in the land of Edom, and Hiram sent him by the hands of his servants ships and servants that had knowledge of the sea. Now Hiram was Hiram of Tyre, Hiram king of Tyre. Tyre was, of course, the center of the Phoenicians. That was the ancient Phoenician capital. Later on, of course, the Phoenicians established the city of Carthage there in North Africa. The Phoenicians were the great seafarers of the ancient world. In fact, it's interesting, there are inscriptions in North America written in Punic, which is the language of the Phoenicians. There's no question, there are several reputable books on the subject. There's no question that there were seafarers that came to the North American continent all the way back. In fact, as you come on down through the story, the Phoenicians very likely this is who Solomon brought here. The Hiram of Tyre, brought these Phoenician ships and these Phoenician sailors to work for King Solomon and to establish his navy. And it talks about these servants had knowledge of the sea. They went with the servants of Solomon to Ophir and took 450 talents of gold and brought them to King Solomon. Well, as you come on down in chapter 9, verse 21, the king's ships went to Tarshish. Now, Tarshish was there right near the what was called anciently the Pillars of Hercules, or the Strait of Gibraltar. It was there on the southern coast of Spain. The king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Every 3 years once came the ships of Tarshish bringing gold and silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Now, they didn't get apes and peacocks in Spain. You've got to go down, in order to get apes, you've got to go down around the bulge of Africa. You have to get down quite a ways. It says that they came around every 3 years, these ships of these ships that Solomon had sent out. You know how long it takes a sailing ship to circumnavigate the globe? Magellan, who was the first modern European, 1500s, to circumnavigate the globe, took him 3 years. Solomon sent out this navy. They went out, they launched from the Pillars of Hercules. Well, where was that? That was the Strait of Gibraltar. And so 3 years later, they came back again. And if you look where they came back to Eilat. Well, if you look on a map, you'll find that's a port on the Red Sea. How do you start out from Gibraltar and come back there at the bottom or at the top of the Red Sea? Well, you obviously have to, at least you have to go around Africa to do it, because you're coming back that way. So the point that is made is Solomon now has worldwide impact. You know, here are things that are coming from all over. Apes from Africa, peacocks from Persia or India. All of these things. You know, tremendous gold and silver and precious stones. And we're told here in verse 22, Solomon passed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom, and all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom that God had put in his heart. And so all of these things came, and the gold, the silver, the spices, all of these things describes the tremendous glory with which God blessed Solomon. Now, this was launched here at the Feast of Tabernacles, this dedication of the temple and the things that occur in the aftermath of that. In many ways, a type of the millennium. Solomon's very name meant peace. And so the knowledge of God's way spreads out. But you know, as you go on through the story, particularly when you go back to read the account in 1 Kings, you find that as the years went by, Solomon became increasingly self-indulgent. And we're told that he took many strange women. And that as he got old, his wives began to turn away his heart. And God, who had appeared to Solomon in a very special way, Solomon began to turn away. Solomon began to lose sight of the tremendous blessings, or at least of the source of those tremendous blessings. He began to lose sight of these miraculous displays that God had poured out. He began to lose the things that were the fruit of this Feast of Tabernacles observed there at the time the temple was dedicated to God. Here was a time of great excitement. Here was a time when the people were all together. Here was a great festival celebration. And yet, it faded. Well, you remember the story. Solomon died. His son Rehoboam became king. Rehoboam was not a good king, managed to, in fact, showed himself pretty foolish and has lost most of his kingdom. 10 of the tribes pulled out and established themselves as the kingdom of Israel, and Rehoboam was left with Judah the kingdom of Judah there at Jerusalem. And as you come on down through the story, we find that after 18 years, Rehoboam's died, and his son Abijah began to rule over Judah, and Abijah only reigned for 3 years. This is in chapter 13. In chapter 14 tells us Abijah died, he slept with his fathers, and was buried, and his son Asa reigned in his stead. Asa became king just a matter of about 21 years after the death of King Solomon. 21 years isn't that long ago, you know. 1999, 21 years ago, that was what, 1978. You remember, you look back on 1978 and, a lot of water under the bridge, but not, doesn't seem that long ago when you think back on some of those events. Well, that was the time that had passed, and Asa became king. And Asa started out, verse 2, doing what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord his God. And he took away the altars of the strange gods in the high places and broke down the images and cut down the groves. Look at how far off the track the nation had gotten in a matter of a generation. Because 21 years from the death of Solomon, Solomon didn't really start getting off track until in the last 20 years of his reign. So you're looking at a period, where did these pagan altars and things come from? Well, you're looking at events of let's say, approximately the last 35 years. 35 years, that's not that long ago. A lot of people had seen these things that had transpired over their lifetime. There were people who had certainly been there and had seen the dedication of the temple that saw things began to get increasingly off the track and obviously went along with it, because it didn't say that these idol altars were empty and nobody ever went there. But now you had a righteous king who came and he took away the altars of the strange gods. And verse 4, he commanded Judah to seek the eternal God of their fathers and to do the law and the commandments. And as you come on down through the story, we find that in verse 9, there came up against Asa Zerah the Ethiopian with a 1,000,000-man army. And Asa recognized, sometimes we have to be absolutely overwhelmed until we come to the point, as Asa did, of recognizing his utter powerlessness. You see, one of the things that stands in the way of us letting God fight our battles is we think we can do it. Now, Asa, when he went out against and he saw this huge army of 1,000,000 men, Asa was so heavily, totally, completely, thoroughly outnumbered that he knew there was nothing he could do. You see, God puts us in circumstances and situations that really are confronting us with what is day-by-day reality, but we sometimes operate under an illusion of self-sufficiency, because self-sufficiency is an illusion. He told Israel, we read back in Deuteronomy 8, it's rehearsed, why did God lead them the 40 years in the wilderness? To humble them and to prove them. And he talks about how he fed them with manna and he gave them water out of the rock and their shoes didn't wear out and their clothes didn't wear out for the 40 years. God put them in the middle of the most inhospitable place on earth, where they were totally unable to provide the most basic necessities of life, which confronted them with the reality of their utter, total, complete dependence upon God. Somehow, if we can get out and, sort of grub with a hoe and plant seed and do certain things, we think, well, look what I've done. I am providing for myself. Oh, you created the seed, did you? Put that life within the seed. That, that's an incredible thing. Just take a little grain and plant it, and a whole plant comes up. Plant a little grain of corn. You got, after time goes by, you got this huge corn stalk. And it's got ears of corn on it, and they're loaded with grains, and all you put was one in the ground. That's an amazing thing. You don't think, well, look what I grew. God's the one who made it grow. God's the one who put that life within the seed and who made it to where it could actually reproduce. Man can't do that. Science said, we understand all about this, and we've analyzed this, and we we've got the molecular chain and the DNA, and we know all this stuff. Just pour some chemicals in a test tube and try to produce one carrot with it. Can't do that. They can start with something that's already created. They can start with life and tinker with it. But you see, God put Israel in a situation where they were confronted with what is reality anyway, and that is the fact that they were powerless to supply their own needs without God's blessing. God put them in a situation where there was really nothing physical they could even do. And so then He provided it. He said He wanted to humble them and to prove them. God is here. Asa is on track. Asa is zealous. He's wanting to do what's right. He gets rid of the idol altars. He does all of these things. And God is wanting to teach Asa some things and to help him. So he allows this army of Ethiopians, this huge army could have gotten turned away somewhere else. Their attention could have been diverted. God could have done a lot of things. He allowed the army to come all the way into Judah. And it was a huge army. And Asa is now confronted with something that he can't fix. It's not a matter, my army is just about the size of theirs. Let's go out and go to it. No. Verse 11, Asa cried unto the Eternal his God, and he said, Lord, it's nothing with you to help, whether with many or with them that have no power. Help us, O Lord our God, for we rest on you. And in your name we go against this multitude. O Lord, you are our God. Let not man prevail against you. So the Eternal smote the Ethiopians before Asa and before Judah, and the Ethiopians fled. And God smote. Asa was confronted with something overwhelming. Now, the Spirit of God came upon Azariah, chapter 15, verse 1. He was God's servant, God's prophet. And he came out to meet Asa. And he said in verse 2, Hear me, Asa, and all of Judah and Benjamin, the Lord is with you while you be with him. And if you seek him, he'll be found of you. If you forsake him, he'll forsake you. Now for a long season, Israel has been without the true God, without a teaching priest, and without law. When they in their trouble had turned to the Lord God of Israel and sought him, he was found of them. And so it describes all of the calamity and all of the trouble. Verse 8, Asa heard these words. He took courage. Verse 8, put away the abominable idols out of the land of Judah and Israel, and the cities he had taken from Mount Ephraim, renewed the altar of the Eternal that was before the porch of the Lord. So rededicated the temple, gathered all Judah and Benjamin and strangers that were with them out of Ephraim and Manasseh and Simeon, for they fell to him out of Israel in abundance when they saw the Lord his God was with him. They gathered themselves together at Jerusalem in the 3rd month, the 15th year of the reign of Asa. The 3rd month is the time of Pentecost. They came here before God at this second of the 3 festival seasons, and they offered to the Lord God all of these offerings. In verse 12, they entered into a covenant to seek the eternal God of their fathers with all their heart and with all their soul. The original covenant made with Israel at Sinai was made at the time of Pentecost. Here, now, Israel comes together, or Judah, and great numbers out of the northern kingdom come down there because they see God's blessing. They see what God is doing. And they rededicate themselves. This is an event. Asa became king about 21 years after Solomon's death. This is the 15th year of his reign. So here we are about 35, 36 years after the death of Solomon. And years have gone by from the time of the dedication of the temple. And we see this tremendous event that takes place, this great period of rededication. They entered into a covenant to seek God with all their heart. And there was great celebration. There was trumpets and cornets. The priests were, the orchestra, the choir. Judah rejoiced, verse 15. They had sworn with all their heart, and they sought him with their whole desire. And he was found of them, and the Eternal gave them rest round about. And so there was blessing. No more war for 20 years, until the 35th year of the reign of Asa. And in the 36th year, a few problems come along. And now Asa has forgotten. You see, the next time he's confronted with a problem here, peace goes by, life goes on. It's easy, to get complacent as time goes by. 20 years have transpired. Now Asa has Baasha, king of Israel, trying to come against him. Now Baasha is a little more his own size than Zerah the Ethiopian. This sort of looks like something he can handle. At least he thinks. Oh, this is pretty simple. I got all this money here. I'll go up here and I'll hire the king of Syria up in Damascus. I'll pay him and get him to come in, get him to attack Baasha, and I'll put this thing together. And so he was going to work it all out himself. God sent a prophet to Asa to correct him. Told him in verse 8, weren't the Ethiopians and the Lubim a great host, a huge host, many chariots and horsemen? You relied on the Lord, and He delivered them into your hand. The eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show Himself strong in behalf of them whose heart is perfect toward Him. You've done foolishly. Now you're going to have wars. You instead of putting it in God's hands, you've tried to solve it your own way. And you have entered into this alliance, and you have gotten yourself tangled up in this mess. You're going to have trouble. If that's the way you want to do it, if that's the way you want to solve your problem, God will step back and He'll let you see what the results of that way is. Well, now Asa got mad. You see, the years have gone by. Asa has prospered. And he doesn't have a very humble attitude. In fact, he gets so mad, he throws the prophet in jail. Then he gets sick. But he's not going to let the prophet out of jail. He's not going to ask the prophet to pray for him. He doesn't seek God. He's mad. So he died. You know, pride stood in his way. Now here's a man that saw a tremendous miracle. Here he led a great rededication of the people to God. And yet what do we see over and over? Time goes by and it wears off. It wears off. Well, you can come on back through the story after the time of Asa, and we read about Asa's son Jehoshaphat, who was a good king, and yet a man who did not have a lot of perception when it came to other people. Jehoshaphat seems to have been a man who desired to obey God, and his heart was right, and God had mercy on him. But Jehoshaphat got himself into a lot of problems because he was sort of gullible. He was the kind of fella that if you were, if you were trying to peddle something, Jehoshaphat was the fellow you would want to find because you could talk him into buying. Jehoshaphat got into trouble because old Ahab, who was as wicked as they come up in Israel, kept talking Jehoshaphat into coming and helping him. In fact, the climax, and it just you just sort of shake your head. You remember the story where God had sent a prophet to tell Ahab that he was going to be killed in battle. Jehoshaphat had refused to go out until they heard from a prophet of God. The prophet of God showed up, told Ahab, he said, I saw Israel scattered like sheep without a shepherd. Old Ahab, who's sort of a conniver, Ahab tells Jehoshaphat, he said, I tell you what, you and I are going to go out in our chariots here with the armies. I'll tell you what, you put on your royal robes, put on your crown. I'm just going to wear some old grubbies. Jehoshaphat did it. You know, he was not one of these fellows who was just, real perceptive of people's motives. He sort of reminds me of somebody who just couldn't believe bad of anyone. I think Jehoshaphat was not a guileful, deceitful kind of person. And it was hard for him to really believe that somebody else had some evil agenda. And so he gets himself talked into all sorts of things. And that's just one of them. That, to me, is sort of the most incredible. Jehoshaphat actually puts on his royal robes, and he goes charging out, in his chariot. Ahab disguises himself so that nobody will recognize him as the king. Ahab's figuring, he's thinking, yeah, they're going to kill a king today. Well, there's only going to be one out there that looks like a king. But you can't outsmart God. We're told that one of the archers just sort of shot. Just sort of a wild shot. And what does it do? It just hits Ahab, just catches him right in a vital spot, and he died. They did see Jehoshaphat. They did think he was the king. They came swooping down on him, and then somebody recognized, oh, that's not Ahab, and so they all turned away and they left him alone. God had mercy on Jehoshaphat and got him out of trouble that he got himself into sometimes. He's the son of Asa, and you come on down through the story. Jehoshaphat made one other serious mistake, was he allowed his son to marry Ahab's daughter. That was not a real smart thing because that daughter was queen by the name of Athaliah, and she was a real chip off the old block, the block being Jezebel, her mother. And that introduced its own set of problems into Judah. And so you come on down all these problems, and we come on back, chapter 29, and Hezekiah became king. And when Hezekiah became king, it was at the time when the Assyrians had come in and had attacked northern Israel. They had already begun the systematic deportation of the people of northern Israel. And so it was a stressful time. People of northern Israel were being deported. This took place over a period of years, and now the armies are threatening, to come on down. They're going to gobble up northern Israel, and they're going to come on down to Judah. Well, we read here that King Hezekiah began to reign, and the first thing he did, chapter 29, verse 3, first year of his reign, the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. He began to repair the temple. In chapter 30, he sent to all Israel and Judah and wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh that they should come to the house of the Lord at Jerusalem to keep the Passover. Now, they wound up keeping the second Passover because when he became king, at the beginning of the first month, the temple was in disarray and everything was polluted, and so they started as quickly as they could to try to fix up the temple and to rededicate it to celebrate before God, but they weren't able to. 2 weeks was too short time to do it. And so Hezekiah consulted with the priests and with the leaders, and they kept the second Passover. The whole nation did. And we find that he sent out not only to Judah where he reigned, not like your fathers and like your brethren, which trespassed against the eternal God of their fathers, who therefore gave them up to desolation, as you see. Don't be stiff-necked as your fathers were. Yield yourselves unto the Lord. Enter into His sanctuary, which He sanctified forever. Serve the eternal your God, that the fierceness of His wrath may turn away from you. If you turn again unto the Lord, your brethren and your children shall find compassion before them that lead them captive, so that they shall come again to this land. For the Lord your God is gracious and merciful, will not turn away His face from you, if you return to it. And the posts passed from city to city through the country of Ephraim and Manasseh, even unto Zebulun, but they laughed them to scorn and mocked them. Nevertheless, a few different ones from Asher and Manasseh and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. And it talks about this tremendous Passover that was celebrated. And people were so charged up in chapter 31. Let's notice in chapter 30. Chapter 30, verse 26. So there was great joy in Jerusalem. For since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there was not the like in Jerusalem. Then the priests and the Levites arose and blessed the people, and their voice was heard, and their prayer came up to His holy dwelling place, even unto heaven. Now notice, just continuing right on, chapter 31. When all this was finished, all Israel that were present went out to the cities of Judah, broke the images in pieces, cut down the groves, threw down the high places and the altars out of all Judah and Benjamin and Ephraim also and Manasseh, until they had utterly destroyed them all. The children of Israel returned, every man to his possession, to their own cities. And Hezekiah began to get things organized, and he did all of these things. And we find that he reorganized the priests and the Levites. The people began to tithe again in verse 6. And then in verse 7, in the third month, the time of Pentecost, they began to lay the foundations by heaps and finish them in the seventh month, which is the Feast of Tabernacles. So you find this time of great revival. And yet, when Hezekiah died, things rapidly deteriorated and got off track. And you find that it was a number of years later, Hezekiah's son Manasseh was very much off track. His son Ammon, Manasseh's son Ammon, trespassed more and more. Ammon didn't reign for very long. And then his little 8-year-old boy, Josiah, became king. And Josiah, again, was one who sought God. And we're told in Josiah, again, set out to have the temple repaired. And they found the book of the law. This is recorded in 2 Chronicles 34:14. And the king, verse 30, went into the house of the Lord, and all the people gathered together, and he read in their ears the words of the book of the covenant. It was found in the house of the Lord. And he stood in his place, and he made a covenant with God to walk after the eternal and to keep his commandments and his statutes with all his heart. And verse 33, Josiah took away all the abominations out of all the countries that pertained to the children of Israel, made all that were present of Israel to serve, even to serve the Lord their God. Chapter 35, verse 1, Josiah kept the Passover to the Lord in Jerusalem. They killed the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. And he set the priests in their charges and encouraged them to the service of the Lord. And so we read about all of these things that took place and the Passover that was celebrated there. And all of this is described. And what we're told in verse 18, or verse 17, let's pick it up. The children of Israel that were present kept the Passover at that time and the Feast of Unleavened Bread 7 days. There was no Passover like to that kept in Israel from the days of Samuel the prophet. Neither did all the kings of Israel keep such a Passover as Josiah kept. The priests, the Levites, and Judah and Israel that were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. In the 18th year of the reign of Josiah was this Passover kept. Time of rededication, a time of revival. And yet, within a matter of years, Judah went into captivity. It arrested the slide for a while. But Josiah died, his sons came along, and things went downhill. Judah went into captivity. Nebuchadnezzar came in and took some of them and came back second time, finally came back a third time, and now destroyed the temple, the very temple that had been filled with the presence of God. The dedication of Solomon 400 years earlier. Well, as you go on through the story, after a period of captivity, this is described in the book of Ezra. It continues the story. Ezra 1 picks up the story where 2 Chronicles 36:23 leaves off, with Cyrus, king of Persia. Verse 22 of 2 Chronicles 36 talks about the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Ezra 1:1 in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Ezra 1:1 actually is Ezra 1 verses 1 and 2 is basically quotes the last two verses of 2 Chronicles. Picks up the story. And the Jews are allowed to return under Zerubbabel. And the story is told that they all come back. And so what do we find? Ezra 3:1. When the 7th month was come, the children of Israel were in the cities, and they gathered themselves together as one man to Jerusalem. And Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel stood up, and they dedicated the altar, we're told in verse 6, on the first day of the 7th month. That's the Feast of Trumpets. Verse 4, they kept the Feast of Tabernacles. And so we find this time of revival and rededication. Here's people finally come back out of captivity. 70 years have passed since they were taken into captivity first by Nebuchadnezzar. Here's a time of revival and rededication. They begin the temple. But then problems and difficulties come along, and work begins to sort of come to a halt. God uses the prophets Haggai and Zechariah to stir things up and to sort of revive the work. And so we see that occurs. That's mentioned in chapter 5 here. And so the temple is completed. But then years go by, and when we pick the story up about a generation later, in Ezra chapter 7, in the reign of Artaxerxes, you find things are off track again. The nation has gotten away. And Ezra, this time, comes back. The story continues right on through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which originally was actually written as one book. Chapter 8 of Nehemiah describes the people gathering themselves together before the water gate. Ezra took the book of the law of Moses. And this starts out, Ezra 8:2, on the first day of the 7th month, Feast of Trumpets. And so then we come on down to the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles. And we find a time of revival, a time of rededication, a time of people who are all stirred up. They have heard the law read, and now they are ready to rededicate themselves. But as you go on through the story of the book of Nehemiah, you find it didn't last. What we find over and over, we find accounts of revival and rededication, people being all stirred up, people being committed, and then we find time going by and things beginning to drift. You know, we've come back from an inspiring, wonderful Feast of Tabernacles. The question is, what difference will it make? What changes will each of us or any of us make in our lives as a result? You know, in ancient Israel, when the nation returned from the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, it was the time when the grain crop for the next year was planted. Right within a matter of a couple of weeks after the Feast of Tabernacles, the early rains began there in November and December that were the sort of the rainy season there that put moisture in the ground. And the new crop was planted. That is what would come up as green ears there in the time just prior to the Passover, as the new crops began to come up and to ripen, and the barley harvest followed by the wheat harvest occurred there in the spring during the time from the Passover season on up to Pentecost. In other words, it was after the feast that they planted the seed, which would determine what kind of harvest they were going to have. You know, the next festivals that they were going to celebrate, when they were going to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles the next year, the kind of celebration they were going to have was going to be very much dependent on what they had planted, what they had done. You and I are in a period, you know, we have a time of months now from the time of the fall on through till next spring when the holy days begin afresh. As we come back from the Feast of Tabernacles, it is a very important time to sort of step back and take stock in our lives, evaluating the patterns in our lives. What have we learned as a result of this year's festival? What changes are going to take place in our lives? Because it is the implementation, it is the follow-through that will determine success. If we can be excited, we can be stirred up at the moment. We can be all charged up on an emotional high. But if there is not a plan for follow-through, you know as well as I do what will happen. We will just simply drift back and fall back in the same old patterns. Because the old patterns are the familiar patterns. And it takes conscious effort to break out of them. If it were simple for us, easy for us to be different than the way we are, we'd already be that way. So, in order to really reap the real benefit, there is a follow-through that's necessary, and part of that follow-through, it has to start with being able to identify what those patterns are. Patterns in our life. You know, there are a lot of different things. Patterns of prayer, Bible study, fasting. That is essential in terms of our communion with God. What are the patterns in our lives? You know, that's something, we know what they are, and God knows what they are. It's a time to examine, because if we're going to do anything any differently in the future than we've done in the past, we have to look and honestly evaluate. And that means to evaluate the strengths as well as the weaknesses. To take stock of things. What are the patterns in our life? What are our patterns of prayer? What are our patterns in Bible study? What are our patterns in fasting? Prayer is the means by which we communicate with God. It's the means by which we draw near to God. Paul talks about the outward man perishes. The outward man gradually grows old and decays and deteriorates. But the inward man is renewed day by day. How do we renew the inward man? Primarily through prayer and Bible study. In prayer, we're talking to God. In Bible study, God's talking to us. You leave one out, you don't have a two-way conversation. Fasting is a tool by which we humble ourselves and sort of focus our attention. That's usually not something that most of us enjoy humanly and physically, is it? It's a time that requires giving up something that we enjoy doing. Most of us enjoy eating more than we enjoy not eating. Fasting is an important tool, but we have to evaluate what are the patterns in our life. And if those patterns fall short of what they need to be, and there's no way any of us can grow spiritually unless we have healthy patterns of prayer and Bible study and fasting. We can't grow spiritually unless there are healthy patterns there. We look at it, we take stock of it, we evaluate it, we honestly look. Then what are we going to do? How are we going to make it any different? You have to be specific. If you start out with a vague goal, well, I want to do better this year. That's great. I guess every one of us, did anybody come back from the feast with their goal is doing worse? Oh, I want to do better. When you're all charged up and everything, I'm going to do better. That's good. We all need to do better. But that's not a measurable goal. I want to do better. That's good. That's a good desire. But what is it that I'm going to do differently? If I don't get specific in my life, then with all the good intentions in the world, you just sort of drift back into old patterns. If you're going to improve your patterns of prayer, well, that involves a lot of things. You can't stay up until 1 o'clock in the morning, surfing the net or watching the late movie. Get up and have effective prayer and get to work by, bright and early the next morning. Doesn't work. You may do it about once. About the second time, the alarm's going to go off and say, I'm too tired. I'm going to sleep a little longer. God begins the day in the evening, and that's when you have to start planning for the daylight is the evening before, because when you go to bed determines when you're going to be able to get up, at least consistently. You cut yourself too short on sleep, and after a while you're going to be just sort of walking in a daze, unable to function. So, when we start examining patterns, it really opens up the whole patterns of our life. If you're going to make a change, then you've got to look at it. You've got to honestly evaluate, what am I going to do differently? What would I like to be doing? How am I going to implement that? What am I going to do to put into practice in my life? Because if I don't seek to grow in terms of my spiritual relationship with God and prayer and Bible study, fasting from time to time, if I don't do that, then I'm not going to be able to really put together other changes. There are a lot of patterns we can examine. Examine the patterns in our family life, in our marriage, with our children, just with in the whole aspect of our family life. What we find as we step back and we evaluate is we tend to fall into patterns, we tend to fall into ruts. We have to honestly acknowledge what those patterns are. Look at them. Take stock of them. What is it that we should do different? What is it that we desire to do different? If you don't have goals, you can't work toward something. Because we're having the opportunity right now, in terms of even our own families, our own households, we are practicing for what we desire to implement in the world to come. That's the area of years Years ago, Mr. Meredith wrote an article for men entitled "Be a Loving King in Your Own Family Kingdom." This was written, I think, way back in the 60s. And, in fact, he did a series of articles on that. You know, there's a principle there. Evaluating the patterns in our family, evaluating our priorities. Priorities of time, priorities of money. The whole priority system that we have in our life, it's a time to step back and to look at it. Some of what we look at, we may look and say, well, you know, that's on target. That's good. Other things we're going to look at and say, well, need to make a little improvement here, need to make an adjustment there. If you don't step back and evaluate those things, then it's impossible to really implement lasting changes. Evaluating even our patterns of service, of the way that we give and help and serve others. You know, our activities. I mean, everything from, we look at the whole gamut of things, of what we're doing. You see, the only people for whom these great festivals of rededication and revival accomplished anything were the people who came away from those festivals implementing specific changes in their lives. Everybody may have come away excited and stirred up and emotionally moved. But they had to go back to their normal day in and day out jobs. They had to go back to regular life just like you and I do. And so, in order to make anything that is a real difference, that is a lasting difference in our lives, we have to focus in on what is it that I expect to do differently. What is it what adjustments do I want to make? You know, without conscious change, we continue to drift in old patterns. That's just life. That's the way we are. It takes conscious effort. It takes evaluation. It takes a desire to do specific things differently. And then it takes God's help and power. But our part is we have to begin to get beyond our deceitful heart, you know, where we kid ourselves. The heart's deceitful above all things, as Mr. Smith brought out in the sermonette. But, you know, God will help us to see what He sees if we really ask Him to. And we start step by step doing what we can do, trying to implement, looking at, examining and thinking about the lessons that we learned during the feast, going back over and reviewing, talking about some of the sermons and the sermonettes and the things that we learned and the points that really hit home. And, you know, different things, depending on what we're going through in our lives individually, different things will maybe hit different people. You can be at the same feast side as somebody else, and something will impact you in a certain way, and something else may impact them, depending on a lot of things that we may be just going through in our own personal lives. But you see, as we do that, as we think about those things and evaluate it, then we're in a position to make choices and to implement those things. Let's never lose sight of the fact, brethren, right now, you and I are planting the seeds of next year's crop.